for Students, where we will explore 18th century life and learn about the people, events, and ideas that helped shape America. Each month, we will bust some myths and misconceptions, explore primary sources, and answer questions that you sent to us in the chat. I'm Divya Brown, and today we're going to answer the question, how did different kids fit into colonial America? Joining me today, we have Janice Canaday and Spencer Chestnut. Let's get started by having you tell us a bit about yourselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Janice Canaday, and I'm a lifetime resident here in Williamsburg, Virginia, and I am currently the supervisor for the Peyton Randolph House at the Foundation.
I'm Spencer Chestnut. I take kids on tours that come on school trips here, do shows like this, do tours of all the different buildings in Colonial Williamsburg, and I've been here at Colonial Williamsburg for 25 years as a historical interpreter.
We're so thankful to have you both here today. Now, the video that we watched a few moments ago shared some rules for children's behavior in colonial America. Are these really some of the expectations for kids?
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about a time period where order is everything. So even at the onset of a very young age, children are learning the right way to address each other, to look at themselves, how to talk to their mama and papa. You don't come into a space without giving your proper courtesies, and you don't move in the space as though it belongs to you. You're waiting until you give them direction as to how to move in that space.
And that's one of the way kids learn to do other things is to read, write, things like that. They copy down rules from books like this, like the School of Manners. Matter of fact, George Washington is one of the children that learned to write by copying down these rules. And there are rules in that book for everything. 44 rules just how to behave at the table alone. One of my favorite rules, though, that I wanted to talk about was the rule in discourse. That's a fancy word for conversation. And it says, if thy superior, an adult, is relating a story, do not say, I have heard this before, but attend to it as if it were altogether new. So even if you've heard it before, pretend like you haven't and be polite.
I'm sure that's something they'll have to remember during this holiday season when all their family gets together. We're going to be talking about children's experiences in different social classes throughout this program. Can you define what social class is?
It's order. It's where you are on the realm, or on the ladder, so to speak. Who's at the top, who's at the bottom, and who's in between, and who's probably not on there at all, but part of society anyhow.
And I think there's really two things you have to talk about with class, but both within society, how you're viewed in the social circles, but there's also the law. As Ms. Janice was saying, some people aren't considered part of society at all, and that's what the law says, not what they say. And that, of course, is defined in the system of slavery, and the laws that are made to say, well, we that get to control who makes the laws, decide that other folks are not part of this society. So whether you are free, whether you are enslaved, there are different rules according to the law of what you do, but as we'll probably talk about throughout this presentation, just because the law says something doesn't always make it so.
That's very well put, especially when you think about Williamsburg's population. By the Revolution, more than half of the population is people of African descent, and almost all of them are enslaved. Since we are broadcasting live from the home of Benjamin Powell, which is one of our original buildings here, let's discuss what life might have been like on the property for the Powell children. Can you tell us about the children and describe what their experiences might have been like?
Well, you had two young girls here, Hannah and Nancy, and their father is a very well-to-do man here in this town, in the capital city, and so they're learning probably on a day-to-day basis how to run a household, housewifery skills, how to mimic what they see Mrs. Powell do, learning how to manage the household records, learning how to invite guests in, how to be hospitable, how to serve at the table, how to make a proper bed, and how to dress for the day, all those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah, and along with that, of course, you have the children of the enslaved people on the property. Mr. Powell was not only one of the most prominent men in society, he was one of the biggest landowners and slaveholders in that time as well. So you have 3 adult women on this site, Nanny, Kate, and Rose, that are enslaved, and each of those women have 2 children with them, and Mr. Powell also has a manservant named Elgin. And with those 10 people on this property, you're going to have a different dynamic. When you talk about the children and their roles here, it reminds me of the story usually of the fox and the hound, where you have a fox and a hound, they grow up and they're friends, and then when they come of a certain age, the hound is told, hey, you've got to help the hunter hunt this fox down. And you'll see that a lot on households. Now, sometimes you'll have enslaved children and free children where the free children grow up saying, well, tell this person what to do. They have no say in whether they can do what you say or not. They have to do it. And then other times you'll have these children growing up together more or less as equals. And then when they get to a certain age, they're told that they're not. And that can be a big shock to people.
Yeah, and it's something very emotional for them to have to come to terms with as well.
Yes.
So the children on this property, Hannah and Nancy, Charles, Jacob, Benjamin, Sarah, Hannah, and John. Definitely should come and check this property out or hear more about the stories here if you can. Nana, Kate, Rose, and Mr. and Mrs. Powell certainly wanted the best for their children. The adults in a child's life are important to the development of the child. Let's hear from two parents from different backgrounds and get their thoughts about raising their children.
Shio, Gasolina, Dogwadon, Aya, Ashkaya, Ani, Guduwogi, Elwode, again. Hello, my name is Gasolina, and I'm one of the men who comes from our Cherokee mother town, Gadua. I have a couple of kids that I look after. Not all of them are actually mine. So my child is named Woloshi. He's a young boy. He's about maybe 8 years old. We call him Woloshi because if you ever looked at a frog, when you get up close to it, it'll just kind of watch you, but it don't really move, right? So that's why we call him Woloshi. But I also have a number of nieces and nephews who are, of course, my sister's children that I help educate and mentor.
My name is Elizabeth Braxton. I am the mother of 9 children. My eldest is Molly. She's 18 now. She got married last year. Judy is 17, and they are both stepdaughters. And then my eldest daughter, Betsy, is 13. George is 12. Corbin is 10. Carter is 9. Nancy is 7. Alicia is 4. And the baby, Dickie, he's only 10 months old.
When it comes to educating our children, we use a lot of stories and oral histories. So in a lot of instances, we never outright scold our children because we want them to be able to witness and experience the world around them. But these stories are meant to serve as a way to help guide them in the sense that if they do something wrong, how to correct that behavior. If they've done something harmful, how can they make amends? Because even in the instance of making mistakes, there is a lesson to be learned in correcting those mistakes. And we hope that that education is something that's going to help guide them throughout their lifetime.
The education of my children has been a large question lately. Up until this point, the children have been educated by tutors. We have employed a tutor at our home. He lives on our property. We pay him a salary. And there is a schoolroom on our property. The girls and boys both share tutors. I say tutors because while we have primarily employed just the one, Mr. Hall, there is also a dancing master and a music master that come in from time to time. But Mr. Hall will teach all of them reading, writing, numbers, history. The girls learn French, but they do not learn Greek or Latin as the boys do. Now, I say it has been called into question lately because our George has just been enrolled at the grammar school at William and Mary. So he is boarding there. It's about 35 miles from our home. And he boards there, and there he has an English classical education. He will have, if he remains at the grammar school the entirety of the time, 4 years of Latin, 2 years of Greek, also such things as natural philosophy, sciences, and he may enter into the School of Philosophy. I doubt very highly he will enter into the Divinity School, but it is a different sort of education. But a child's education is not just in the classroom, because they must also learn how to be young ladies and gentlemen. And for the girls, that means managing a household, and that means managing slaves, for the boys too. But for the boys, it also means learning planting. We primarily plant tobacco, and so they must know what the proper things are to do at the proper season of the year. Everyone has learned a little bit of cooking. My boys even have learned, the girls certainly have learned sewing, but even the boys have learned a little bit of sewing. Mending a tear, sewing on a button. My George didn't want to learn how to sew. He said, "Mama, that's girls' work." He said, "One of my sisters will do it for me, or you will, or one of our slaves." And I said, "Well, that's all well and good, but you're nearly the age for the militia now. And what will you do if you are at a militia drill and a button pops off your breeches? Are you going to bring it to your sergeant and say, 'Sew this back on for me'?" And that was the end of that argument.
When our children get older, they are expected to fulfill the roles that they choose for themselves. So in many instances, we as parents have very little expectations of our children because they are not us. And so the things that we find necessary for ourselves to, again, find our own happiness or way in life, they have to find for themselves. And so as they get older, they're going to grow to see the things that they like to do. Maybe they like making baskets or making pottery, or maybe they enjoy farming or going to war. Those are going to be the roles that they are expected to fill once they make the decision to take on those responsibilities.
My husband is a gentleman. He does not work with his hands for a living. I am a lady. My children, when they grow up, will likewise be ladies and gentlemen. And as ladies and gentlemen, they will be expected to be leaders in society. And certainly the boys will be expected to take on roles in the community, whether they serve in local government or government on the Virginia level remains to be seen. But they will be expected to manage households, the girls in particular. They will be expected to be good masters and mistresses. They will be expected to be parents, and they will be expected to be leaders in Virginia.
What I'd like most from my children is, as they get older, the experiences that they've had throughout their lifetime are able to shape them and give them a sense of self. So when we think about children being their own autonomous individuals, much of their education is centered around them making the best decisions that they can to bring them the most happiness and the most safety. So within their lives, they are going to experience choices that will harm them and choices that will be good for them. And so hopefully they're able to stand on their own 2 feet, that within our absence, they'll be able to make the best choices for themselves.
What I most want for my children, and I'm afraid this is going to sound rather depressing, but I wish for them to survive. If you can survive your childhood years past the age of, say, 8 or 9, you can generally expect to live a long life. And so what I want most for them is long and happy and successful lives.
Those are two very different ways of raising children. What is it that they both have in common?
Well, they both have a love of family. Family is very important. The children are very important in the children's future. So they're doing the best they can to raise them to be as productive, and as successful as they can be.
And I think when we talked a little bit about the laws and society and social classes and all of those things. A whole lot of people have a whole lot of different ways of wanting to go about things. And sometimes people talk about things, well, if I have something, then somebody else can't have it. And there you have a lot of push and pull between different groups of people. But within all of that, you find out that most of the time what people want is the best for their children. But they have very, very different ways of going about it.
Yes.
And deciding what the best is going to change with those people and their beliefs and culture too.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
That's something we see a lot today in our culture and our society when it comes to child raising.
Exactly. Exactly.
Susie asked, would the gentry children be the majority of those who learn the rules in the School of Manners?
No. There's more than one set of School of Manners. There's the manners for those gentry children, as you're talking about, the middling sort, the lower class, for the free blacks and for the enslaved. There's manners for everybody. And everybody's going to be taught on-the-job training. From day-to-day life, you're being schooled by your parents and those around you. And so you might have a written book of manners, but there's that mother wit that teaches that spoken manners to children. Letting children know that you can't always say everything you see. Don't say all you hear. Keep a still tongue in your head. And when they tell those stories about whether grass can speak or what the snake would say, and how the snake, how the frog doesn't move when it sees a snake, all those sorts of things. They've got stories that teach children life's lessons as well. So every group of people have their way of expressing manners and courtesies.
Right. And then we have Aaron, who wants to know who picked the children's names in the 18th century.
Well, again, we go back to the law. I mean, usually you would think it would be your mother and father that would pick your name, or it would be a family name or something like that. And a lot of times for people that can control that, that's true. But when you're talking about a society where people are not free, then when your master, your owner, if you're someone that's enslaved, they maybe buy you from somebody else. You might have had a different name. Now your name gets changed to whatever they want it to be. The only semblance of choice that one man ever had in his life involved his name, but never got another choice, and his name was Billy Lee. He was George Washington's manservant, went wherever he went, did whatever George Washington said. And he also was a hairstylist. Whenever Washington would go into battle, he did not wear a wig. He styled his hair, and I should say Billy Lee styled his hair. But he knew of the fashion of the military officer, that kind of a bob style, the two curls on the side of his head. And Billy Lee is the one that did all of those things. Did that during battle. And through all of that, he did not run away, as he probably had plenty of chances to do. For whatever reason, he didn't, whether he was unable, because we know later on in life Billy Lee hurt his knees. Whether fear came over him that he might, in the middle of a battlefield, meet a worse end than being with people that could, fight back against the enemy. Whatever the reason would be, he didn't go. And his reward for not running away during all of those battles, George Washington said, do you like Billy as a nickname, or would you rather I called you William? And he picked William, so from then on, Billy Lee was William Lee. But that's the only choice that we know of that he ever had in his life, and that was a choice that did not have to be given to him according to the law.
We do know that sometimes enslaved children, their parents or the adults, the elders, would name them according to what the mistress wanted, because they're someone's property. And they would also sometimes, after the Revolutionary War, and times after that, they would attach names to them that would help their family find them. Sometimes the master's name, that surname, so they could record their history, where they've been, and also so their loved ones can find them when they need to.
I think that is very powerful too, because we do know the names of some of the enslaved people who were here in the 18th century, but that is always the question: was that the actual name their parents gave them? Did they even know their parents? Scott wants to know if there was a lot of interaction between children of different families, like the modern playdate.
Absolutely. Children are children. Children grow up, play with each other, don't think anything one way or the other than just let's have some fun. They bicker, they fight, they have good time together. It's not until they reach a certain age where they move from one stage of life to another that the adults are going to put that wall between them and let them know, now you have to move over to this space, and maybe you'll become an owner, and this person's going to be your property, and you're going to take instruction from this person and not speak back, and you get a different set of manners how you're going to address that person.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Ariana asked, how old did the children, have to be a slave?
Well, according to the law, when you are born, you are enslaved. There is no choice in the matter, again, according to the law. And actually, when the only difference is if you are the child of a free person and an enslaved person, which they called mulatto in the law, you are a free person if your mother is free, but not until you're 31. So that would be the age at which somebody would, according to the law, stop being enslaved, but only under very, very specific circumstances. Most of the time, those circumstances are not met. So if you are someone that the law says is to be enslaved, you are a slave from birth. But again, enslavement according to the law and enslavement according to who you are and the culture you have are two very different things. And as we've been talking about, those folks would find many different ways to have their own culture, their own life lessons, their own school of manners, throughout any circumstances that they might be in.
I would just add that if you go by the law, as soon as that child is forming in that mother's womb, that's someone's
That's
property. And so you're enslaved. Your mother's enslaved, you're enslaved.
Yeah. And that must have been a heartbreaking conversation for them to have, because it's not something they're going to know. It's something that they're going to have to learn as they grow.
And be told.
And
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, and a lot of times when you're in a situation like that, the first thing that anybody wants to know, free, enslaved man, woman, child, or adult, is, well, here's the situation I don't like and I don't want to be in. What do I have to do to get out of it? And the answer your parents have to give you is, well, the law says you can't.
These have been some good questions so far. Please keep them coming. But something that's very important to talk about with children is also clothing, because clothing and fashion are a big part of our lives, whether we like it or not. You might have heard someone say not to judge a book by its cover, but have you ever judged someone on the clothes that they are wearing only to discover that there is a whole lot more to that person than the fabric that they are clothed in? Do you think about what you wear each day? How do you make that decision? Let's visit with the milliners to learn a little more about children's clothing in the 18th century.
Welcome to the Millinery Shop. We are here today to talk about infants' clothing, babies' clothing, children's wear, all the way up to teenage fashion. The 18th century would come to the millinery shop to buy the ornaments for their wardrobe, things like cloaks and aprons and ruffles and shirts for men, and their babies' clothing. Little ones could have an infant's gown that fastens in the front with a very wide band for around the belly. It's very long because they wanted to be able to fold it up to protect the little one's legs and keep them warm. These are in cotton, but below it there's one in silk satin. So sometimes it's the fabric that tells us maybe that it was a child of a very prosperous family or one of very limited means. But children and babies dress with their clothes fastening in the back instead of the front. Now this is for a baby who obviously has not started to walk yet. When they do start, or you begin to think they're going to learn to walk, that's when they would get the little short skirt of their gown. And something else our parents give us when we learn to walk are little caps that are padded. They're called pudding caps, and they're supposed to protect our brains if we fall on our heads as we're learning to walk. Something else our 18th century parents gave us is a pair of stays. Well, these are made of pasteboard, or what we would call cardboard today, and they're designed to help us stand up straight and give us good posture, teach us how to stand well as we're learning to walk, instead of perhaps afterwards like we do today. You notice I have not mentioned that there's little boys' infants' clothing and little girls' infants' or babies' clothing or children's wear. And that's because the 18th century dressed little boys and girls, infants and babies and children alike. But then about 4 or 5 years of age, a little one, is beginning to be able to talk and communicate, and maybe communicate outside the home. So a little boy may be given more of something that looks like dad's coat, but he's still got his petticoats on. He's still got his skirts on. So now that little brother has gone to the tailor for his coat, waistcoat, and breeches, and is dressing like a little boy or a young man, his sister is still wearing a back-fastening gown, but it too looks a little bit more like Mama's gown. 18th century people thought that different colors were fashionable or not fashionable. So little boys sometimes do wear pink, and sometimes little girls wear blue, or any variation of those colors. The fabrics, again, are whatever choice the family wishes to make, because the fabric, cotton, wool, linen, and silk can be sold at just about every price. So pretty much everybody in Virginia could come in and shop here, whether they're rich or poor, free or enslaved. There are fabrics available. And children, young people, are dressed alike in style. Again, it's the fabrics worn that may tell us a little bit about how much that family was willing to spend on the clothing.
The milliner mentioned that young boys and girls were dressed the same. Did they really wear dresses, and when did they start switching over to breeches?
Well, usually to be about 6 or 7 years old, but really it was up to the parents. But as Ms. Janae said in the video from the millinery, boys and girls pretty much wear the same type of garments when they're younger. A matter of fact, there's a picture that we have of Benjamin Howlett, a very young child. You guys can see that picture now, wearing that kind of uniform gown for children. And then there's another picture I want to talk about that's a picture of a man named, or a little boy named William Randolph. And a lot of times people see this picture that you're looking at now, and they will see the dog, and especially the blue ribbon, and they'll say, oh, that's why we know it's a boy, even though he's wearing a gown. But those kind of indicators aren't quite as old as you might think they would be. Matter of fact, pink is for girls, blue is for boys is really a 19th and 20th century thing. It happens gradually over time, and really where it kind of explodes as far as, everybody must be doing this as a societal rule happens when advertisers get involved, people that make clothes. Well, people are having lots of children now. If you have a boy and then your next child is a girl, or vice versa, we don't want you saving the baby clothes. We want you buying all new baby clothes. So a lot of the things, and you would be surprised, I could spend a lot of time on this, but I won't, about all the different things that we do that we think have been around for forever, but the only reason we think that is because somebody was really good at selling us something.
Definitely have a future live stream for that topic, though, Spencer. Robert asked, what was the most popular thing to do for an English or American child in the 18th century?
The most popular thing?
Mm-hmm.
Play.
Yeah.
Play.
It takes on all different forms. You could see some of them on the table here, the
Yeah.
board games, dominoes, tops to spin. This right here is a pin. It's like tabletop bowling. So you have 9. It's a game called 9 pins, because with this game, instead of 10 pins like you might be used to, there's only 9. But I think the most popular thing to do is play. But of course, what we want to do and what we get to do are two different things sometimes. And that's just something we call life.
Mm-hmm. Now, with children, we know that they start off as babies. So this question from Barbara, she wants to know what was used for diapers in the 18th century.
Well, I'm sure they had their own type of rough cloth that they put together and would create some sort of covering for the children.
And actually, I learned this from Janae at the Millinery, and it's an actual specific weave in the cloth that they use that's called diaper. The original weaving pattern that they use is called the diaper weave, and today we use many, many different things for diapers, but back then it referred to the pattern that the cloth was weaved in.
That's interesting.
That is interesting. See, this is why I like these live streams. I learn new stuff too. Were girls expected to work outside with their hands in the 18th century?
Well, it depends on what girls you're talking about, and not necessarily work. You've got different classes of people, as we've established. So young girls who are from the gentry class or upper middling sort, they're going to be out there maybe working in the garden with their mothers. A garden sometimes can be therapeutic. It can be a form of hobby. But then you have other folks, the other classes, who have to do the agricultural thing. They are out there working and planting.
Yeah, and on all levels too, again, you have different work with the hands, what's going to be expected, but especially with the gentry girls, and Ms. Janice was talking about, there's a couple of different types of things they might learn to work with their hands as well, things that aren't necessary, like instead of sewing to fix your clothing, which both boys and girls are going to have to learn how to do, they're sewing, making pretty pictures, playing a musical instrument, something like that, because one of the status symbols back then is learning how to do something that you absolutely do not need to know how to do as a way of proving you're better than everybody else.
It's always competition.
Absolutely.
And if you're interested in seeing some of that, we have some in our collections at the art museums that they can also see online. Now, going from gardening and playing, what chores did children have in the 18th century, and did they get an allowance?
Well, again, all of these questions, the answers vary according to who you're talking about. And so all children have some sort of chore. It might not be the same because every household is different. We know that free black children are going to have chores. We know that that enslaved children are going to have chores naturally. But you think about someone like Hannah and Nancy who were here at the Powell House, I'm sure before they had folks to do things for them. Their mother taught them how to do those things like air the linens and washing the floor cloth and, the windows and sweeping things up, sweeping the floors off and dusting. They had those things to do as well.
Now, another question is, did kids celebrate Christmas? We got the holidays coming up, so I know that that's probably the first thing on a lot of children's minds these days, rather than work and chores. It's what's coming for the holiday season.
That is a question that has all kinds of answers. So the short answer is yes. But it's a little bit different when you talk about the 12 days of Christmas, if you've ever heard that song with the partridge in the pear tree and all. The first day of Christmas is Christmas Day. And the big party day is not that day. You go to church on that day. It's a very religious thing. The 12th day of Christmas is January 6th, and they have a big party on January 6th called 12th Night. And as far as they were concerned, January 6th would always be throughout history a day of great celebration and parties. But when you have that kind of situation, you have a lot of people getting together with families for family reunions, a lot of people getting married over that time period. George Washington, actually, he got married on January 6th to Martha Washington. But there, again, as we've talked about, depending on who you're talking about, it's a whole different thing. And going back to that dynamic of the enslaved, they would celebrate in their own way if they were allowed to do so. And a lot of times they would be, but not necessarily for the reasons, we want them to be with us and celebrate and party, although that might be the case sometimes. But a lot of times, if they're too busy partying and having fun, they won't be thinking about running away. And there was one person, his name was Landon Carter, who one of the biggest, wealthiest families in Virginia, actually the biggest by far, was the Carter family. And Landon Carter, one year in his diary, said, "I took great pleasure in not letting my people, the enslaved people, celebrate the holiday in any way whatsoever, just because he could." So it all depends on who you are, but the short answer is yes, they celebrated Christmas. The long answer is it depends on who you are and where you are, what and how you can celebrate.
I would like to add, too, that, at the end of the year, the harvest is in and the fields are at rest. And so it's a time of celebration, but you're living in a complicated time and very complex. And so for the enslaved, it's also a time of hiring out. So there's not just a celebratory time, but there's a time of angst. Folks are worried about what's going to happen, who's going to be sold off, who's going to be traded off or hired out, how far away they're going to be, how long will it be before they come back, that sort of thing. So it's just a mixture of feelings and things going on at the same time, depending on who you are.
I think you also bring up a good point, because the holiday season on a plantation is very different than a holiday season in a domestic gentry household. Like for a lot of individuals who are enslaved in Williamsburg, that's probably the busiest time of year for them, because who's doing all the work for the parties and the
That's
weddings
right.
and the
Absolutely.
celebrations.
Yeah.
Now, is it possible for children in one social class in the 18th century to climb to another? And if so, how?
Well, the short answer is marriage. If you marry somebody in a higher social class, when Ms. Janice was talking about those household chores that some of the Powell children would learn, you actually would be able to, in some cases, marry into a higher social class. Mr. Benjamin Powell, as a matter of fact, is one of the very, very few people in this society who is able to move from one social class to another, but the Revolutionary War intervenes. So in British society, pretty much where you're born is where you stay. And that's what we call a caste system, C-A-S-T-E. But in this kind of new society we're making after the Revolutionary War, Mr. Powell's daughters have married up into a higher class. He becomes a judge in the court. And actually, oddly enough, because of his position and his daughter's position in high society, when Nancy's husband, John Burrell dies, he actually sues his own daughter. And that's because Benjamin Powell is the executor of the estate for John Burrell. And actually, we think it may be to protect his daughter, because the creditors are coming. The people that you owe money to are coming after the money that they're owed. And as the person who's in charge of making sure that John Burrell's estate pays off all its debts, he wants the court to say, okay, well, here's what she has to sell to pay off her husband's debts, and here's what she doesn't have to sell. And one of those things that she might have to sell are the enslaved people. And so that's another situation where you have angst. Whenever somebody passes away, what's going to happen to my family? Are they going to be split up? Or are they going to be sold off to somebody else? And that's a case of Mr. Powell using someone else's children, those enslaved people that might be sold, to pay off debts to protect his child from having to pay a lot of money that she might not be able to pay.
These are great questions, and please keep them coming in the chat. And here at Colonial Williamsburg, we learn a lot about our history from studying primary sources. Primary sources are artifacts or first-hand accounts directly from the time period that is being studied. Today, we're going to look at an apprenticeship contract and discover what it tells us about the lives of children in 18th century Virginia. This contract from 1793 places James Williams, an orphan, to apprentice as a tailor with George Suggs, the master. Can you explain what an apprenticeship is and what this contract means for James Williams?
Well, apprenticeship generally is when you're learning a trade to help you make a living, a skill that you can take into your life. And really the contract, the indenture, which is another word for contract, it just tells you what your obligations are. You know, you have to, then they're all worded differently, but you have to do what your master says. One contract says you have to obey all of your master's lawful commands. And in this case, we're not talking about an owner of a person like we would in enslavement, but we're talking about the owner of that business. But while you're an apprentice, they are in charge of you. They do own your time and your work. Mm-hmm. And that contract ends when you're 21 years old. But yeah, I remember in one contract it says, you know, as long as it's not illegal, you have to do whatever your master says. And in turn, they are responsible for feeding, clothing, educating you, and such as that.
Now, were apprenticeships just for free children, or were there also enslaved people who were apprenticed?
Enslaved children could be entered into an apprentice contract as well by their owners. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times you would find mulatto children who sometimes were the children of the owners, mm-hmm. Would be entered into a contract such as that as well.
Do we still see apprenticeships being used in today?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
We had the apprentice school for the shipbuilding,
Yep.
shipyard. Mm-hmm. But we also have people here to come to the foundation that are actually interns and apprentices here.
Now, each month we tackle some myths related to our topic. These are things that we have heard and may commonly be said, but may not actually be correct. Janice and Spencer, what is a myth that you would like to address related to children in the 18th century?
So kids, you know how the adults always tell you, like when they were younger, everybody minded their parents and everybody did exactly what they were told. And if only you acted as angelic and wonderful as we acted when we were your age, the world would be at a better place. Yet none of that's true. Always, even back to the 18th century and before that, there are always rules that kids don't like. We've talked a lot about the laws that they don't like and don't think are fair. And that actually the law pretty much says, oh no, we're not being fair. We're going to set the law up so that the people in power get to stay there. And you see that all the time throughout history. But just those kids, like Miss Janice said, their favorite thing to do is play. That's the most favorite thing of anybody to do. So all of those rules and manners, while they are important, the kids would rather be doing what they want to do. And so there's always that pushback between children and adults. So there's always been times where people are saying, I don't want to do what my parents tell me, but the parents also trying to raise them to do what they think is best for the children.
Yeah. You know, another myth is where folks think that there was nothing positive or good that came from or for an enslaved child's life, but that's not true. Children are very resilient. They were then and they are now, but they weren't locked into the circumstance so much. They were physically locked in, but not emotionally locked in and spiritually. And so they are creative. They're resourceful. They dreamed. They hoped. They imagined. They told stories. They sang songs. They sang songs and things that talked of what they were experiencing in that moment, but they sang songs and talked of things that they would hope for in the future. And so they had times of pleasure and they had times of great joy. And they learned to appreciate the small things that they did have. It wasn't always the big things, but it was the little things. Someone to tell you that you mattered, someone to tell you about your smile, or to give you a hug, or to tell you to go ahead and dream a dream, you know, to look up at the stars at night and imagine, you know, those stars are your ancestors that have gone on before you, that's your mother smiling down at you. So they weren't without hope. Right. And they did operate outside of the constraints of the law.
I think you both bring up very good points in that human nature is consistent no matter what time period you're in, but also when it comes to slavery, which is so dehumanizing as an institution, no matter what was done to these people, in spite of what was done to them, in spite of the laws, their humanity, withstood that strength of spirit they had. And
The resistance. Yeah.
that's one thing that should probably be the first thing that's taught about these people, not so much what the law said about them or what they did for other people.
Exactly.
Now, we have a question from Scott, going back to apprenticeship. What if the apprentice, in this case, has a passion for, say, cabinet making instead of being a tailor? Will that apprentice have the opportunity to change?
Yes. So the apprenticeship contract can be broken, but it has to be by mutual agreement of the apprentice and the master, unless the apprentice is not fulfilling their end or the master is not fulfilling their end. So if the owner of the business is not teaching the person, everybody kind of gets their initiation when they start into something. Hey, pick up that broom, go over there and do all the menial work, sweep up and do that kind of thing. Some masters will never let you get past that point. Oh, we're getting all this sweeping up done. We don't have to do it. We're making money. They don't pay about an hour back then. You need to make more to make more. So if you are sweeping up and doing things that don't really involve the trade, but it's helping them make more money because they can make more stuff, then they might just keep you at that level, and you or your parents can step in and say, hey, this person's not teaching me correctly. Or by the same token, they can the master can say, hey, this person, they're running away, they're not paying attention, they're not picking up the work fast enough, they're not fulfilling their end, they're misbehaving. Or it might not be any fault on either side. Hey, like you said, I just like one trade over another. I think I'm better at something else. In any of those cases, the court can step in and break the contract, and in some cases, the court has the right to extend the contract. Because if your contract ends when you're 21 and I'm 19 years old and I decide I'd be better at something else, now that other master only has my labor for 2 years as opposed to 7 or 8. So the court can say, oh, well, instead of the contract ending when he's 21, it'll end when he's 26. So there's a lot of different leeway in there. Yes, you definitely can take up another trade if you feel like you're better at that.
That is good to know because, I think that's something a lot of people today experience where you think you're going to do one thing and then you realize, no, I have more of a affinity for something else, not being confined to one thing. Now, we are nearly out of time. Before we have to go, do either of you have any final thoughts on how different kids fit into colonial America?
I think that, as we've covered, people are people. That's really, if I had one thing to say, it would be that. It doesn't matter if you're young, old, man, woman, free, enslaved, one of the tribal nations, one of the American Indians here, or one of the people in the cities, wherever you are, and no matter what city, what area, what time period you live in, people are people, and just the most important thing you see in any kind of instructional book, whether it be the Bible, whether it be the School of Manners, whether it be anything, is be good people and treat each other right. Patrick Henry said it best in an edition he made in his will, kind of a little thing he wrote on the end that he wanted people to read. He said, reader, whoever you are, remember this, practice virtue thyself and encourage it in others. So be good and encourage others to be good. Are people good all the time? Absolutely not. Was Patrick Henry perfect? Far from it, but neither is anybody. So do your best and be good is what I would say to everyone.
I would say follow the example of children. In the 18th century and those other times, children just played with each other and accepted each other. They fought, they argued and debated, but they also forgave each other and they loved each other. And I think if we were to follow the example of those children then and children today, if they're left alone, they get along just fine. So as adults, we should pay attention to their example and their lead, learn from them, and how great a world we would have and what kind of impact would we make on our society today if we lived like that.
I think those are both perfect points to end on. Like, let's all try to be good and better versions of ourselves, but also adults, remember, we might have more life experience, but that doesn't mean children do not have things to teach us as much as we hope to teach them. Amen. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of CW Kids Ask and for sending us so many awesome questions. We encourage you to find out more about growing up in the 18th century. This project was funded in part by a generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Thank you, Janice and Spencer, for joining us today. And don't forget to watch our next episode on December 8th when we'll ask the question, did everyone agree about declaring independence? Until then, have a great day.